A first-class ticket to redemption, the story of Marcus Bennett. Marcus Bennett stood quietly in the crowded terminal of Logan International Airport. His duffel bag hung heavily from his shoulder, not just with gear, but with the weight of memories from places he didn't care to revisit. His boots, though freshly polished, carried scuffs earned in dusty war zones. He was a man in his mid-30s, his strong build tempered by months of hardship, and his sharp eyes softened only by the thought of seeing his family again. It was his first time home in nearly 10 months. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the bag as he approached the airline counter. In his hand was a first-class boarding pass, a ticket he'd splurged on as a reward to himself for surviving his most recent deployment. He had nearly talked himself out of the purchase, telling himself the money could be better spent on his wife, Jenna, or their 6-year-old daughter, Naomi. But Jenna had insisted, "You've earned it, Marcus. Take a moment for yourself." So here he was. The airline attendant at the desk smiled warmly as she scanned his boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Bennett," she said. "And thank you for your service." Marcus gave her a polite nod. "Appreciate it," he said softly. He wasn't the type who sought gratitude for his service. His job had never been about the accolades. As he moved toward the gate, his fatigued body carried him with quiet dignity. His uniform, clean, pressed, and heavy with insignia, drew a few looks from travelers. Some curious, others respectful. But Marcus paid them no mind. He had learned a long time ago to block out the noise. He was almost there. Just a flight stood between him and home. Boarding call. When the boarding call for first-class passengers was announced, Marcus rose from his seat in the waiting area and moved toward the line. As he approached the gate, he was met with the familiar mechanical beeping of scanners and polite smiles from flight attendants. First class. A small luxury, but a well-earned one. Once inside the plane, he made his way down the aisle, searching for his seat, 2A, near the window. Perfect. As he approached, his gaze landed on the woman seated in 2B, the aisle seat next to his. She noticed him, too. Her name was Victoria Langley. Victoria was the kind of woman who seemed to live in perpetual disdain of the world around her. Dressed in a tailored cream blazer, designer sunglasses pushed onto her head, and an oversized Birkin bag perched on the seat beside her, she exuded the casual entitlement of old money. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight chignon, and her manicured fingers tapped impatiently against her phone. Marcus stopped politely beside her, gesturing toward the window seat. "Excuse me," he said. "This is my seat." Victoria didn't move immediately. Instead, she glanced up at him over the rims of her designer glasses, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, she raised a brow. "This is first class," she said, her voice cool and detached, as if stating an obvious fact. Her gaze dropped to his uniform, lingering just a second too long before returning to his face. Marcus nodded, his tone remaining polite. "I know. Seat 2A." Victoria's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Are you sure?" Marcus felt the air shift slightly. His training, years of it, taught him to pick up on tension before others even noticed. This was one of those moments. "I'm sure," he said, still calm, but his voice was firm now. Victoria sighed audibly, glancing around the cabin as if searching for support. The other first-class passengers, business travelers in suits and a retired couple quietly sipping champagne, pretended not to notice. "I just find it surprising," Victoria said at last. "No offense, but—" "I mean, you're in uniform." Marcus's jaw tightened just slightly. He had endured worse. Far worse. But the implication was clear. "No offense taken," he replied, his voice clipped. "I purchased the ticket." Still, she made no move to adjust her position, leaving her bag where it blocked his path. The flight attendant, a young woman named Claire, appeared at Marcus's side, sensing something was wrong. "Is everything all right here?" she asked politely. Victoria's response was immediate. "I think there's been a mistake," she said. "This man seems to think he's supposed to sit here." Claire blinked. "Mr. Bennett?" she asked, checking Marcus's boarding pass. "No mistake. This is his seat." Victoria's face hardened. "I see," she said tightly, moving her bag at last. Marcus slid into his seat, setting his bag beneath his feet. The hum of quiet conversations resumed, but the tension lingered. The weight of silence. For the first 30 minutes of the flight, Marcus said nothing. He stared out the window, watching clouds drift by as the plane soared over the eastern seaboard. Victoria, however, wasn't finished. Every few minutes, she would let out an exasperated sigh or shift in her seat with exaggerated discomfort. She ordered a glass of Chardonnay and sipped it as though she were suffering through an ordeal. Eventually, she spoke again. I just don't get it, she said, more to herself than to him. I thought first class was for people who, well, you know. Marcus turned slowly to face her. No, he said. Tell me, who is it for? Victoria hesitated. Professionals. Executives. People who've earned it. Marcus chuckled softly. I see. Victoria didn't catch the warning in his tone. No disrespect, of course. It's just, well, I suppose times are changing. Marcus leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight. He'd been taught to pick his battles. But some things demanded answers. You have no idea what I've earned, he said quietly. The witness. What neither of them knew was that someone 2 rows behind had been watching the entire exchange. Jacob Whitman, a philanthropist and CEO of Whitman Enterprises, had been traveling home from a humanitarian conference. A man in his late 50s with a reputation for tackling systemic inequality through philanthropy and policy, Jacob recognized the dynamic instantly. The veiled prejudice. The entitlement. The ignorance masquerading as superiority. And the calm, dignified composure of Marcus Bennett. Jacob said nothing. Not yet. But he was already thinking ahead. The flight continues. The flight settled into its routine. Meals were served. Drinks poured. Victoria said little more, though her glares toward Marcus didn't stop. When the plane finally touched down in Atlanta, Marcus was among the last to rise from his seat. He gave Victoria a polite nod as he collected his bag. She said nothing in return. As Marcus walked through the terminal, his thoughts turned again to Jenna and Naomi. They would be waiting at baggage claim, Naomi likely holding a homemade sign that said, "Welcome home, Daddy." He didn't expect to hear his name called from behind. Mr. Bennett. Marcus turned to see Jacob approaching him, his pace steady but unhurried. Yes. Marcus asked. I wanted to say, Jacob began, that I watched what happened on that flight. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, unsure where this was going. You handled it with more grace than most, Jacob continued. More than I would have, if I'm honest. Marcus offered a faint smile. Thank you. Jacob extended his hand. Jacob Whitman. I run a foundation that supports veterans re-entering civilian life. We're always looking for leaders. People like you. Marcus shook his hand firmly. I appreciate that. I'd like to talk, Jacob said. No pressure. Just think about it. Marcus nodded. I will. And just like that, a new door opened. A chain reaction. Over the next few days, Marcus found himself thinking more and more about Jacob's offer. He had planned on taking time to rest, to decompress. But something about the man's words lingered. Eventually, Marcus visited the Foundation's headquarters in downtown Atlanta. It was a modest space filled with photographs of veterans and success stories. The kind of place where work, not status, mattered. Jacob introduced him to the team. They weren't looking for a figurehead. They wanted a leader. Within weeks, Marcus had taken on a role as Director of Veteran Outreach, helping soldiers transition into civilian careers. His military experience and the quiet resilience he'd honed over years made him an ideal mentor. The video goes viral. What Marcus didn't know was that a young woman on the flight had recorded his confrontation with Victoria. She had debated for days whether to post it. Finally, after seeing the lack of accountability for such everyday acts of prejudice, she uploaded it. The response was immediate. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. Absolute grace under pressure. This man is a hero. She should be ashamed of herself. The hashtag first class justice trended for days. Victoria Langley's name was eventually revealed. Her employer, a luxury real estate firm, issued a statement within hours. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. Ms. Langley's employment has been terminated. A meeting of fate. Months later, Marcus stood backstage at a conference on leadership and diversity. He was about to speak about his experience and his work with veterans. Before he stepped onto the stage, a familiar face approached. Victoria. She looked different now. More subdued. Humbled. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly. What I did. I was wrong. Marcus studied her. What changed? She hesitated. I lost everything. My job. My reputation. But it forced me to look at myself. I've been working with an organization on racial bias training. I'm trying to be better. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a start. Victoria sighed. I don't expect forgiveness. Maybe not today, Marcus said. But keep doing the work. Redemption. Victoria's journey of reckoning became part of Marcus's presentation that day. Not to shame her, but to show the possibility of change. I believe in second chances, Marcus told the audience. I believe people can change if they want to. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Conclusion. Marcus Bennett's story became more than a viral moment. It became a catalyst for deeper conversations about race, privilege, and resilience. And as he stood beside Jacob Whitman at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new veterans center in Atlanta, he knew that sometimes the battles you don't choose can lead to victories you never imagined.